Today, I am joined by Dag Detter. He's a Swedish investment advisor, as well as an author and speaker on the topic of public commercial assets. He's the co-author of the books The Public Wealth of Nations and Public Net Worth. In his previous life, he was the former President of Stattum and a director at the Swedish Ministry of Industry, leading the restructuring of government portfolio of public assets during their reforms in 1998 to 2001. He's the founder and managing partner at Detter & Co. I'd like to start today's interview with a quote from Dr. Goh's biography that I think perfectly ties in with what you advocate for in your books. The lesson is that the free enterprise system, correctly nurtured and adroitly handled, can serve as a powerful and versatile instrument of economic growth. And one of the tragic illusions is that many countries of the Third World entertain is the notion that politicians and civil servants can successfully perform entrepreneurial function. It is curious that in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, this belief persists. And so in the name of socialism, equality and justice, millions are denied the escape from age-old poverty which rapid economic growth can provide. So with that, I wanted to ask you, does this tragic illusion still persist today, where civil servants think they can hold on to the entrepreneurial function?
Yes, I think this lays at the core of the whole issue of managing the asset side of the balance sheet in the public sector, and the importance of professionalism and not outsourcing, but having an independent body to manage your assets. Just like we have outsourced the interest rate to a central bank and the debt management to a debt management office, that has happened in most places around the world, especially after the Asian financial crisis in the 90s.
We can understand the importance of having an independent central bank that looks at managing interest rate according to macroeconomic objectives that it sets out, right? But in the case of public wealth, it's quite amorphous in a sense that we don't really know what public wealth is. I think a lot of governments don't have a clear sense of what is the public wealth that they have. So if you could, maybe you could give us a functional definition of what public wealth is and how much of it do we have across the globe today?
Yes, generally around the world, we have assets, public assets that are worth almost 3 times GDP. But since governments do not have proper accounting, they don't have accrual accounting, we are quite unaware of these assets. So you could say infrastructure is around 2 times GDP, which has been verified by the IMF. And then on top of that, you have what is commonly called SOEs. I'm not very fond of this name because it's only at the national level, while you have lots of corporates and entities at the local and regional level in larger countries. But so I prefer to call them operational assets, which are corporates and utilities, etc. That's usually at least half of the GDP in value. And then the most secretive, the most hidden asset is actually real estate, which has a value of equivalent to 1 times GDP. And in most countries, we're not talking about Singapore now, but we're talking about the rest of the world. Real estate is very rarely understood by governments and is a really hidden gold mine that can be used much better.
Why do governments underestimate that? You've highlighted that maybe they don't account for it properly, but what are governments why do governments tend to undervalue real estate assets, and what can they do about it?
You have to realize that you have a balance sheet. So the focus today in the debate when we are talking about public finance, because most governments use cash accounting, they're only looking at whether they have a budget surplus or deficit. And then the second focus is whether how big the debt is. I mean, the first thing about the budget is like any household trying to not spend more than you are earning in generating in revenues. However, the human beings, and so are governments and politicians, they like to spend a little bit more than they actually are earning, which means that they're always discussing how to finance this deficit. Are we going to borrow money, which means that future generations have to pay for it instead, or are we going to increase taxes, which will make us unpopular today? So most politicians like to be popular, so they rather borrow and make them popular today and make future generations pay. If you have accrual accounting, means that you are recording everything as it happens, and which also creates a balance sheet. And this was an invention that is almost 800 years old and is it's one of the most fundamental and most important inventions that we have in human history. It has laid the foundations for capital markets, for corporations. Without accrual accounting, we would have no market economy whatsoever. And the funny thing is, in my view, is that governments they are forcing corporations and private citizens to use accrual accounting, but they refuse to do it themselves. If you would start using that, you would see that you have a balance sheet. So you have assets and liabilities. Liabilities are debt, but also other liabilities that are less visible, like pensions, and that you have to pay someday, which means the net of that, assets minus liability, is net worth. And that is a much more interesting focus for a government and for, like you're saying in Singapore, by generations, for generations. Focusing on the net worth means that you are conducting your public finances today with an eye on what are we leaving for the future generations.
Do you think it's the reason why governments avoid accrual accounting despite the fact that they're implementing it or regulating or expecting the private sector to follow this standard?
On a practical level, I think the people that are working in governments are mainly economists and lawyers. Probably most frequently they are economists, and they don't study accounting, which means that this is something that they frown upon. But in business, in the private sector, you couldn't survive a day without understanding accounting. So, of course, for the public sector, it's always proven to be very difficult to introduce accrual accounting, which is much more sophisticated and much more useful, because the people that are running the governments are economists and they don't understand accounting. And of course, politicians in some countries are not very fond of transparency either. They don't want to show that they are not investing, not doing the maintenance on the roads or water pipes, etc., but rather spend money today so that they make the population happy and vote for them and like them today, and not care about whether they are increasing the debt or other liabilities or improving the assets for future generations.
One of the things that really struck out to me in your first book was the fact that to unlock public wealth, you actually recommend that we keep public wealth out of the hands of government, not necessarily through privatization, but in the hands of a professionally managed independent company. I'd like to ask, why is that so? Why should we actually pursue such a approach instead of having a government actively being involved in the managing of these public assets?
Well, I think that's the essence of what Gokul Sui, which is one of my favorites, was trying to say, and I think he said it very eloquently. I mean, governments are not set up to take risk. Their job is to minimize risk, to create a safe environment through monopoly on violence and create a safe world for their citizens, and by providing a military, a police force, a legal system, etc. Their job is to create this safety, minimize risk. While in business, the job of a business person is to take risk, but to understand risk. And these are totally opposite things, and opposite mindsets, opposite personalities. They just don't go together at all. And that's why you need to separate them. When I was running the equivalent of Temasek in Sweden, my prime minister especially, but also other politicians, always, this was a huge transformation. It was like doing what Temasek did for 20 years or 30 years, we tried to do in 3 years. So we basically replaced all the politicians on the boards of these companies, and I often got the question why I don't like politicians. I have nothing against politicians, but politicians do not belong on a corporate board because it's a different job. So having that in a separate entity, arm's length from a government, as you have done in very well in Singapore, with running the corporate and real estate assets inside a public wealth fund, which is your Temasek, and the liquid assets that you have generating from exporting and generating cash in a sovereign wealth fund, which then invests abroad in securities. That is the way to do it.
I like how you kind of gave the contrast of mitigating or managing risk in two different senses. One is to minimize and one is to get a return on risk. And there is also another aspect that you discuss in your book, which is that there is when governments involve themselves in managing the public wealth, there is a tendency for corruption, or there is a tendency to create perverse outcomes for the country. So instead of enriching the country, it might create a worse off outcome for its citizens. If you look at the examples, I think you talk about Amtrak, you talk about Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. These as examples as how government involvement in the corporate in managing public assets could lead to perverse outcomes. How do these perverse outcomes emerge?
I mean, the first instinct is, of course, again, accounting. And this may not sound, very exciting, but it's, if you're aiming for the wrong things, if you are, cash accounting will make you just look at the current situation. Are we creating a deficit or a surplus in the budget? Do we need to raise taxes or not? Do we need to raise more debt? And this confuses things. This makes it very difficult for people to understand what is really going on. With accrual accounting and with a focus on net worth, you can really see, you can do lots of transactions, lots of investments, spend money, etc. Are you spending money for investments or consumption? It will affect the net worth. So if you are focusing on the net worth, you will see whether the policies, the decisions that are made by the government are actually making the country richer or poorer. And because it may sound flashy to invest in certain things, and this is what many governments do. They like to invest in things, but they are actually not have a positive outcome for the finances of the country or the balance sheet of the country. They're actually wasteful, or they're actually more in terms of consumption, or they are just taking too much risk. But if you constantly focus on the net worth, you will understand, everybody will understand. Stakeholders who have borrowed money to the country, people who are employed in the public sector, and people who are paying taxes, etc. Everybody will see whether the country are managing their wealth properly or not, just like you as a private individual would do, or as a corporate. All the decisions that a corporate are doing will be synthesized in the stock value, in the stock price. And this is what you do with the government as well. You basically give the government a stock price which is visible to everybody. Are we making the country richer or not?
If you were to advise the government, you need to start adopting this accrual accounting, and you need to, not involve yourself in the private managing these public assets. What will you do? What's the advice that you would give?
Well, many countries are, especially today, are thrilled by, and they have listen to the lure of setting up a sovereign wealth fund, which is historically something that was done by resource-rich countries that had excess liquidity generated from export of these resources. And that needed to be managed without creating inflation in the country. So they are focused on investing in securities that they can buy and sell quickly if the decision. So they're basically voting with their feet whether they like the security that they're investing in or not. And they're investing abroad so that they're not creating inflation at home. But countries that do not have an excess liquidity or have a budget that is always in surplus have their balance sheet that they need to manage much better. And for that, they need to set up a public wealth fund, which is Temasek. And to manage that at arm's length from short-term political interference by employing professionals. So you're not outsourcing the management of these assets. You're just creating the capacity basically in-house, inside, in the government basically, but at arm's length from short-term political interference. Just like Temasek and GIC, who has very good example of this.
If we were to say that you set these firms up, they will manage the assets independently, what would be the government's role then? Because now they're not managing the public assets. So what should they do? Are they just purely focused on regulation and governance now?
The government is the owner. So if you think about it, if you think about a pension fund, we don't have the same discussion in a pension fund. When we pay in to a pension fund or an insurance company, we are expecting that money to increase so that when we retire, we will have money that we can live on. And we don't want the pension fund to manage those money so that they are less than what we put in. We expect that money to be much larger when we retire, which is 30 or 40 years later. So our expectations on them is to be professional asset managers and invest them cleverly so that our money grows and we will have much more money when we retire. We should have the same expectations on a government, that they set up a holding company that acts professionally and manages our wealth, which are railways, post offices, ports, corporations, real estate, so that this grows for us when we get older, that it's not broken, but rather even better, more efficient, more productive, and higher value. And that also when our grandchildren will need these assets and services from them, they are even better. So it's the same expectations that we have on a private sector pension fund manager, that they should increase the value and manage those assets to maximize the value using proper accounting, of course, and not have a political agenda, but rather just make sure that we increase the wealth of the country.
You talked about real estate earlier, about it being one of the invisible assets. In what sense is it invisible?
I mean, the first reason why it's not visible, it's because of accounting. The second is because it's dispersed over many institutions. The reason that accounting doesn't show it, because many governments, first of all, they have cash accounting, which doesn't really have a balance sheet at all. So we don't think in balance sheet terms. We only think about the budget and we think about the debt, which makes it lousy businessmen to manage the public finances. But let's say that we have accrual accounting. Even when we do have accrual accounting, many governments have chosen not to value real estate mark them to market, to have the market value of the real estate. So they are valuing them at historical cost, which for many countries, they have acquired them 100 years ago or even longer, further away, which means that they are booked at zero. And that means that when you have thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of real estate properties and they are booked at zero, you have no idea that you have them. So when you look at the guiding map for your public financial management, you see real estate, a couple of million. And then you ask somebody, well, how many properties do we have? Like I asked one of the mayors in a US city, and he said, we don't have many. We have like 300. And they're not worth very much. And yet, as you can see in our balance sheet, I had done the valuation before I met the mayor. And they actually had 12,000, not 400. And it wasn't worth a few hundred million, worth billions. It was worth 1 times the GDP or the economic output of that city, which was in this case was Boston. And another city, Pittsburgh, the market value of the real estate was 70 times the book value. And there you can see why I call it the hidden wealth, the gold mine that cities and countries are sitting on. Because it's usually only value, even London, even UK, not only the US, but the value that is in the books is usually between 10 and 20% of the real value, the real market value.
How do you extract the value out from these assets? Because now that you've done an appraisal or evaluation of how much they are worth or possibly worth, how do you extract the value of it? How would a professional manager extract the value out of it vis-a-vis maybe the government who would previously maybe just let it sit there?
Yeah, this is a question many politicians always ask because or economists who doesn't work with developing assets or managing assets. But it's like, you can imagine if a city, a US city or a European city or an Asian city, that say we don't have any real estate. And suddenly we just did the valuation for Sri Lanka and they had no idea that they had real estate. And we found real estate worth 1 times GDP, several 100,000 properties. Think about it yourself. If you are a professional real estate person and you have, you count yourself lucky, you have 20 real estate, and suddenly somebody tells you that you actually have a portfolio of 100,000 properties. I mean, would you have a problem creating value from that? I mean, it would be like a dream. So, I mean, when you have that many, let's say a city has 10,000, which is more realistic or more easy to describe. Some of them are going to be derelict and haven't collected rent for 30 years. Some of them will have collected rent, but it hasn't been adjusted for the past 20 or 30 years. Some of them are, brownfield and they haven't been used. There's nobody living there because nobody can agree on how to develop them. So once you get the map, which is the accounting, you see what you have and you start seeing, wow, we own all of this. The first measure is, of course, to start sending out bills for people to start paying rent who haven't been paying. They've been very happy that nobody understood that they were living there or having their business there. And then the other ones, raising the rent so that the market, according to the market, and then starting to develop the ones that are derelict or misused or haven't been managed well. And then all the brownfield and greenfield. If you walk in an American city, you will find parking lots all over the place. And it's because the government just doesn't understand that they have this. And you will also find beautiful areas in many cities around the world, along waterfronts, etc. And there are just too many political owners who can't agree what to do. But if you delegate this to professionals, you will see results very quickly, as if it was privately owned. I mean, this is the key. The government should act with its assets as if it was privately. You don't need to privatize, but you need to act. In other words, you need to create the environment with the holding company and with the professional people on board as if this was privately held. Then you don't need to privatize. And when you privatize, when you sell it not because you're desperate, but because you found, okay, I can't do much more with this, or I don't need it. It has no use for society anymore, and it doesn't create any yield. Somebody else can probably develop it much better than I. So you're thinking and acting just like any professional.
Now that you can unlock the financial value, what about the social value? For example, you have you talk about a school maybe being misplaced, right? It's currently in the prime real estate strip. And, by moving the school elsewhere, And the students can still reap the benefits of a higher quality education, but the property value has no impact on the students' education. Are there any other examples where, by having this kind of delegation being done, that you could unlock greater social value for the country?
Well, I mean, you have this example. The example you take is the famous one from Copacabana, where there was a school, a 2-story school at the Copacabana beach, and every other building on that street, which is the most expensive street in Latin America, were high-rise 5-star hotels. So, of course, by moving the school to an area which is more conducive and not so attractive to sit and dream that I would rather be at the beach than studying, you could build probably 10 schools and much better quality. And this is often the case when you discuss with a politician or a mayor. He says, don't touch my hospital, don't touch my library, don't touch my school, etc. The thing is, when you go to the hospital and ask the manager of the hospital, you say, so how do you like your building, the premises that you're in? And because we are considering, what to do with it. And he said, I'll move anywhere if you can give me a more modern building, because this building is outdated. Same goes for many schools and same goes for many libraries, etc. Especially hospitals, this is extremely important because the technology, the science of treating people in medicine changes really, really fast. So you need to have modern buildings. These old buildings, they look nice and they are in a fantastic location. But since the government often owns at least half of the real estate sector in a city, you have lots of opportunities to find a better location, build a purpose-built modern building for the hospital or for the library or for the school. It doesn't mean that they need to move out of the city, which is not conducive to learning or healthcare, etc. But the government is such a huge, dominant property owner that you will find, once you understand how much you own, you will find alternatives and better ways of serving the community by upgrading and modernizing these facilities.
Yeah, you're right. So I think even when you think about upgrading the existing infrastructure, it's not just blindly, doing the same thing at the same spot, but it could be trying to see how you can optimize your current mix of how you use your land. And that could be where the private sector, where their expertise and skills will come in handy. So we already talked about the fact that you need accounting. You need clear accounting. What are the other conditions for success in order for such a arrangement to be successful within a country?
The most important factor is for the politicians and the public finance officials and all the stakeholders and taxpayers and everybody to realize, to make the leap in their minds that these are commercial assets. So once you realize that a railway, the post office really is a logistical player, and a railway is a transportation player, etc. They are commercial. They are commercial entities. It's not an extension of the government. This is kind of thinking that corporations owned by the government is an extension of the government, of a policy. That kind of socialist thinking we left in the 70s or 80s. And once you deregulate, once you realize that competition is the most important thing to create economic growth, you have to treat these commercial companies as if they were privately held, which means value maximization. And once you get over that, you unleash a power which is incredibly powerful, because the moment you start thinking that you're both a policy instrument and a commercial instrument, you get quite confused, and which means that you are afraid to do anything. You can only have one single objective. And this is the liberating idea, really, that these assets are commercial and should only have one single objective, which is value maximization. Once that is very clear to all the stakeholders, all the people that are working with or inside these corporations, you will see miracles.
The government should focus on being the regulator and really focus on solving the market failures in certain cases, and then the corporates or the corporations should really focus on squeezing out as much juice as they can out of their asset. In some cases, the government would, for example, like for the corporates themselves to maybe solve for maybe market failures through the company itself. So the example is the post office example, right? Where maybe some areas are underserved because they're rural. How should the government and the corporates think about, how do we solve this problem, given the fact that they both have now separate objectives in mind?
I think you're talking about, universal service obligations that, like a post office, they need to be able to, the government should ensure that everybody in a country is serviced with basic services. And when you have a large country, this is a problem. You have outbacks in Australia, you have China, you have lots of places that are not, serviced best, or in Sweden, we have our northern part, which is vast, even if it's small country. And the corporates that are owned by the government, let's say a post office or a railway, should try to focus on what is commercially viable, because otherwise we're giving them two objectives, and that is where everything goes wrong. So the services that are not possible to service on a commercial basis should be instead removed from the government corporation and outsourced and then procured in competition, so that procurement, that is the best way. If you can, competition is the essence of everything. So if we can create competition in that procurement, and whatever it takes, if that needs to be every 3 years, every year, or every 5 years, or every 10 years, it depends on the assets. But we just need to find that and regulate that in a proper way, with good having good accounting as the basis. If it's a larger country, we can create the competition. If it's a smaller one, it will be difficult. But it's much better than obscuring the objective for a state-owned corporate or a municipality-owned corporate, which then will be totally confused. What is its role? To be commercial or to be an extension of policy? So this is absolutely critical, that any commercial company that you have should not have any policy obligations whatsoever. No subsidies, because it's the subsidies that creates the corruption, it creates the inefficiencies, etc. So a single objective for both. If you're a policy company or policy service, that should be funded by taxes. If you're a commercial company, you should live only on your revenues that you generate from what you're selling.
Now I'd like to maybe draw on your practical experience during the time where you were helping to lead on these reforms. I think, if I'm not wrong, in the late 90s to the early 2000s, you said something about the Swedish way. I think during that period, there was a huge wave of what you say, the governments leaving socialism, and then they're transitioning into a time of massive deregulation and privatization. But Sweden went with a different way. What was that way?
Well, Sweden didn't agree with the privatization, or it wasn't Sweden actually, because the previous government in Sweden had a privatization as the single objective of that government, which was a conservative government. Then when the socialist government came into power, the economic crisis worsened, and they had to take care of basically the public finances that they had created, which was, completely bloated and was a big drag on the Swedish economy. Sweden was in real economic and financial trouble, and the IMF and many other organizations were basically knocking on the door and saying, you need to privatize your vast public sector. But the socialist prime minister didn't want to do that, so he wanted to run the corporate portfolio as if it was privately held. And that's when I was asked to lead that effort. So basically we had a 3-year mandate to turn around the portfolio as if it was privately held. A politician is never very popular by privatizing. Privatizing is always bad politics, if you say, because people don't like that kind of a change. But we actually privatized. We sold. I don't like the word privatize either. We sold 8 times more public assets than the previous conservative government did in twice that time. We were able to do that because most government companies, as you know, in Singapore and everywhere else, when they are state monopolies, they are conglomerates because they are not asked to provide a yield. They are not seen as commercial. They're seen as a policy extension. And they don't want to show that they have a profit. They rather hide that profit through obscure accounting, but also by investing in all kinds of assets that are completely irrelevant to the mission that they have from the government. So usually the rule of thumb is 1/3 of the portfolio inside an SOE is usually non-core. And that you can sell without any political objections, and also to the benefit of the efficiency and productivity and the yield of the company, so that they start to focus on what they're supposed to do, on their core business. And this also makes magic. And when you then have set up a proper capital structure, you make efficiency on the operational side, and then you have a business development side, which is completely focused on selling off the non-core, but then of course expanding on where you have a core business, like you have done in many of your companies within Temasek. So once the banks, once the port, once the telecom company were up and running and were efficient and didn't have any non-core businesses and any ballast, they started to expand abroad because Singapore is a small country. And they've done that very successfully. But then they focus on investments that increase the yield, increase the value, not to hide profit from the government.
Personal note, I wanted to ask you, because you did it for over 30 plus companies during your time there. Do you have any of your favorite or stories that come to mind, or examples that come to mind that really showcase the strength of this turnaround?
Financially, and what's most visible to the outside world, it was probably the forest company, which was the best performing company on the stock exchange that year, which we restructured completely. We sold off all the non-core, etc., and it was a huge success financially on the stock exchange. However, personally, I probably even more proud of the more traditional companies like the railway, the airline, the defense company, the electricity company, the telecom company, and the real estate. That was a much less glorified transformation. It was filled with political trouble, etc., and lots of people that had to be laid off. Lots of businesses sold off, and left were, for the railways, we sold off travel agencies, ferries, airlines, taxi services, travel agencies, hotels, casinos, restaurants, everything. And left was just the cargo business and the passenger business. And of course, that created a lot of resistance and bad press. But we did create very good companies that were able to meet the future deregulated market. And the same with many other, like the defense and telecom, etc. And then in the telecom side, we created a Nordic champion, etc., which was necessary in those days. So, yeah, those are I think very interesting, but less, call it, officially successful.
Less sexy, I suppose, which is actually, I think, yeah, but I think that's what's needed, because earlier you alluded to the point about how a lot of these countries are like jumping the gun of pushing for SWF, a sovereign wealth fund, where maybe they should be more focused on locally consolidating their assets, creating a national wealth fund to better make use of their existing assets, as opposed to going overseas to invest in the equities.
Well, I think most countries don't really see the difference between a sovereign wealth fund and a public wealth fund. They want investment into the country, and the best way they can do that is by setting up a public wealth fund and managing their existing assets much better. That will attract much more FDIs, much more investments, much more productivity, and economic growth in society. Instead of trying to, the worst example is probably Egypt, and then you have places in Africa, there's just complete misunderstanding of how to attract investors. If you create companies and a portfolio of assets that actually are really high performing, investors will come.
And if I may ask, why do you think they are enticed by this, in the sense that, why do you think they've gotten this wrong? Why are they pursuing these lofty ideas instead of maybe focusing on managing what they have right now?
Well, it's back to the quote by Gokong 3. Many politicians actually think that they can run a business, which they can't. That's number one. And number two, politicians think that they will be more popular if they make a lot of investments. And it's also very sexy to run around the world and be in those circles. It's a dead end, I would say, to be quite frank. I mean, it's like many things in life, like training or improving your health through training. It's not glorious. It's hard work. It's boring if you like. Some people are born happy to say, I love exercising, but not everybody. But if you want to achieve that kind of a health, you need to put in the hours. You need to put in the sweat. And it's nicer to just take a pill or to swallow some snake oil salesman who tells you can achieve that much cheaper, much easier in 5 minutes with me and just pay here. But it's ridiculous. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and you're right. So, but I thought what's encouraging was the fact that what Sweden accomplished was that you could actually have a turnaround, which is that you can actually have a way that you can act as if it's private, make better use of your assets locally, and then even create national champions like what you shared. If there were lessons to be taken away from the Swedish experience during that period of reform, what would it be? What would the lessons be for policymakers?
I mean, it's very difficult to say. I mean, most people will not do it. Just like you can't get people to exercise. When they get a heart attack, yes, then they will come to the doctor and say, please help me. Okay, and then he says, you need to exercise, you need to stop drinking, and you need to stop smoking. People will not listen to that unless they are in deep trouble. It's the same, unfortunately, with governments. For a business person, it would be obvious. They have a goal to make more money. So you could always tell them a good idea and they will probably try it if they think it's clever. But for a politician, their job is to avoid risk. It's very difficult for them to follow this path unless they are absolutely forced by financial, fiscal problems or debt sustainability. So the two biggest drivers is, countries and governments that really are desperate for fiscal space, which is, increasing your non-tax or in this case, non-tax revenues, and improving your debt sustainability, which is, of course, what many countries are now facing. But it's very difficult to come with these recipes when things are fine and people are paying their taxes and nobody's complaining.
You kind of alluded to, some of the things that Temasek did right, in a sense of they were, I think, one of the first pioneers in building up the National Wealth Fund. So in the early 70s, they look at consolidating the operations, and there was huge political will to not interfere excessively. If we were to look at Temasek today, or if we look at Singapore today, and you would, serve as an informal advisor to them, and one day they'll come to you and say, if I want to improve maybe the yield of my assets, or if I want to improve my governance, what would your advice be to them?
No, I don't think there's anything. I mean, you have three entities. You have the Monetary Authority, and you have Temasek, and you have GIC. I mean, they're excellent. They are the gold standard in this business, no doubt. Some people would criticize, the appointment of relatives to politicians to the board, etc. I think that's ridiculous in the sense it's a valid criticism, yes, but it's not. It's ridiculous in terms of because the whole governance system, the whole board, everything else is absolutely without any comparison anywhere in the world. The only thing with Singapore when it comes to public financial management is the accounting. I do think that Singapore would benefit from introducing accrual accounting. It may not be conducive to the thinking of the government because they're not very fond of transparency. However, I think that's the wrong place to look. Accrual accounting is not about transparency. Accrual accounting is about having the proper map how to make from which to make decisions. So it's like having cash accounting, which is what Singapore has. It's like having an old paper map of a place when you're trying to navigate. So instead, having, call it Google or digital, where you not only see the geography, you can have overlays of satellite pictures. You can have overlays of what is the traffic like? Where are the congestions? Where is an accident? Where is, you could even overlay CCTV cameras. What's happening in this area? Do I really want to go there? Or should I direct the traffic somewhere else? I mean, this is incomparable. Running the traffic system of a place with a paper map or having a digital system is incomparable. And the same thing I would say is between cash accounting and accrual accounting.
And I think what you're saying is not just accrual accounting, but the accrual accounting has to be public. It has to be transparent in the sense that it's not something that you just do it, maybe within the ministry. You're saying that this accrual accounting should be public information.
If you only had it in the ministry, it would be such an important tool for the government. But I think, if I'm an investor, if I'm going to invest something that's going to last 50 years in Singapore, I think it's worthwhile for me to understand, what does the public wealth look like? What does the net worth of that country look like? How are you taking your decisions? On what basis are you doing it? Today we are trusting the absolutely gold standard culture of Singapore, which it has no comparison in the world. But it's a leap of faith because you understand Singapore, you think you understand it, etc., and you hope that it's going to stay this way. But if it would be even better if you had some numbers to show this is our net worth, and with this current decision, our net worth will be increased. It's not going to deplete. I think that's quite powerful, both for investments and for the future of your people. That you can see, this is where I want to have my children grow up, because this country is only going to be stronger, not weaker. We may be small, but we are extremely clever and agile.
And in that sense, it's also a safeguard, like what you shared. New Zealand has done a good example of accrual accounting. So how did accrual accounting help New Zealand in the sense of improving its ability to generate yield from their assets?
The best example to show how accrual accounting has helped and the focus on a fiscal measure primarily, which is net worth, is that New Zealand may look like a paradise island in the Pacific, but it's prone to weather and earthquakes on the same scale as Bangladesh. So it's in a very difficult spot, which means that they're going to have many surprises for their public fund. And they've had, for the last 20 years, at least 2 earthquakes. They've had one pandemic, just like the rest of us, and they've had one financial crisis like the rest of us, or 2 actually. They have come out of these crises faster and stronger than any other developed economy, because they have this net worth that they can always rely on, so that they can invest themselves out of. And there's lots of research that shows that countries with stronger net worth come quicker out of a financial or an economic difficulty, and they also have a lower cost of capital, because the bond market sees the net worth and gives you a higher rating and lower cost of capital. So it has many benefits.
I think it's time for the closing questions for today's interview. I guess you're based in Sweden, and as a Singaporean from the other side of the globe, I wanted to ask, where are the places that a visitor to Sweden or someone coming to Sweden for the first time must visit?
My favorite is always, when I come to a new place, is to rent a bike. And if you come to Sweden or Stockholm especially, renting a bike, or if you come, you can borrow a bike from me. Seeing a place on a bike is I think is brilliant. And also, of course, if you come to Stockholm, you have to go on a boat, because we have some 30,000 islands.
And then the last question I have is maybe advice for a graduating student entering the workforce. It could be for, a Swede, a Singaporean, it doesn't matter.
I think it's very important to get out to work, study and work in completely different place from where you grew up. So, I mean, if you're in Singapore, go to China, go to the US, go to Europe, but get out of your comfort zone. And that's always, both for studies and for work. Try to get out there. Don't get comfortable. You don't have to say that to people in Singapore, of course, but to most other people, it's very important not to get comfortable. Always be curious.
Yeah, I think we need that. We need a healthy dose of that as well in Singapore. With that, thank you, Dag. Thank you for coming on to the show.
Thank you. Very kind of you.
If you enjoyed this episode, click on the video that's appearing on the screen right now.